if we're looking to the Bible to give us permission for every single thing that we are going to do, we're going to be disappointed. Electricity is not in the Bible, right? Like I could go on and on and on. There are so many things that there is no. So really the only thing that we can do is really come to know Christ fundamentally. And from there, we get, from that relationship, we really can intuit whether something is moral or immoral, and to support us in that and really to guide us in that. That's why we have the church, right? The pillar and foundation of truth. And the church is really meant to interpret the Bible for us. And the church has done that, and they've done a beautiful job. And you know what the only thing that they've said about astrology is? Don't use it to predict the future.
Will you just give us like a super quick rundown of like who you are and what you're up to? And then we can dive into this conversation, because I think that will be very necessary to preface
Absolutely.
you and your expertise.
Yeah, totally. So my name is Janelle Lara. I'm a wife and mom. I'm a theologian who focuses on spirituality in my work. I'm also an astrologer. And so I have this kind of eclectic combination of interests and things that I like to talk about. But yeah, a lot of people know me because I was in business for a long time. I'm a copywriter and a marketing expert, but I've kind of redirected my path towards something that I'm actually incredibly passionate about and have been for a long time, and I've kind of been in the closet about. And so I'm pursuing my doctorate in applied theology, and I hope to incorporate kind of what the exegesis that I'm working on now is really on the story of the Magi in Matthew. And, my hope with my work is to really figure out ways that we can apply theology and spirituality, and even ancient spiritualities practices such as astrology, into modern day theology, into the modern day Christian faith, to support really kind of this, what I would call a spiritual awakening that the world is going through right now. And so that's what I'm doing, and that's what I'm up to.
Of all of that. And I definitely think that it is needed in our world right now. So, piggybacking off of that, like I just want to dive in and talk about, there's a lot of concepts, a lot of avenues, a lot of components that kind of fit under this umbrella of spirituality or quote unquote new age practices, right? That are actually not entirely new, right? They have very ancient roots that our modern day society doesn't necessarily understand or know or buy into or practice. And I think there's just a lot of unknown and a lot of fear around a lot of these topics. And so I want to specifically talk about astrology today with you, and really take it through the lens of, my big question is, like, for me personally, I am a Christian. Even more specifically, I am Catholic, which I feel like is necessary to share with people and make that distinction, because there are a lot of distinctions there. But even personally, I've run into this on my spiritual journey and my faith journey, and finding that intersection that feels good and comfortable, but also right and true based on what God has created for us. And so my big question for you is, like, why are Christians afraid of astrology? And I think that's a big, there's a lot to dive into, but I think that is like the overarching component that I just really want to dive into. And I think there's so much to discuss here, but what is your initial reaction and initial thought to that massive question? And then we'll kind of take it step by step and see where we land today.
Absolutely. There are so many components to that question. So I'm going to do my best to not turn this into a word salad. Okay. So let's start with that concept, new age, because you mentioned it. You're like, they call it new age, but it's not really new. The term new age it's actually an astrological term, and it comes from the idea that the world, Earth, has ages, and as it's going through the sky, it is progressing through different parts of the sky and through different seasons that are much longer than our seasons here on Earth, right? Because obviously we are human beings on this, planet and, in our solar system, and we experience seasons in a very specific way. However, you think about an ancient planetary body like the Earth, and a lot of times we don't realize that the Earth also experiences seasons, right? And so without getting too far into, the rabbit trail that is progressions, basically the seasons of the Earth, the way that human beings have been able to understand them enough to be able to explain them is we can tell based on the spring equinox where the sun is rising, which part of the sky is the sun rising, okay? Right now we are in the Piscean age, okay? When the sun rises on the spring equinox, right? When in the transition into Aries, it's rising in the sign of Pisces. However, very soon the sun is going to rise in Aquarius. We are entering into, so it takes about 2,200 years for the Earth to go through one of those zodiac seasons, right? The Earth size zodiac seasons. So for the last 2,000 years, we've been in the sign of Pisces, okay? So when people talk about the new age, the Aquarian age, that's what we're talking about, okay? You'll notice that the sign of Pisces correlates perfectly with the time of Christ, with Christianity, right? So Jesus came at the beginning of the Piscean age, okay? A lot of astrologers believe that Jesus was a Pisces. We believe his birthday was February 28th. Essentially, the belief of the new age spirituality and ideology that has been corrupted, I believe, is that Christianity was born and bred for the Piscean age. And as we move into the Aquarian age and into subsequent ages of the earth, we will no longer need Christianity. The world will no longer need Christ. Of course, that's false, right? Of course, that is I believe, an evil belief, right? However, I think we're getting to why Christians fear the new age so much is because this new age spirituality, which again is just a term, has been co-opted, I believe, by malignant forces, and it's no longer a it's no longer a diversity of ways that we can communicate with God. And it's no longer an expression of the abundance of the ways that God reaches out to us and reaches out his hand, right? Like you think about the um Da Vinci's painting on was it Da Vinci? Michelangelo's painting on the ceiling of the Vatican, right? Where it's like man is like this, and God is like striving, reaching, like he is reaching for us and trying to contact us all the time. And he loves us so deeply. And in so many ways, he's trying to reach out to us. And I think because of the way that the New Age spirituality has been co-opted by these forces that are trying to make it uh, egocentric, and the church really has allowed it to happen and has really removed itself from the spiritual space in a lot of ways. Christians rightfully are afraid of anything that seeks to remove Christ.
Mhm.
Right? And so because of this notion among New Age spirituality that we're entering into the Aquarian age, thank you very much, Christianity, for what you brought us during the Piscean age, but we're moving out of that. We're moving into a new age. We're moving into a new time, and Christ no longer applies here. I think that's one of the major reasons why Christians are so against New Age spirituality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I love just the history and the components that you share there because I think it's so much deeper than most people, right, have any understanding or knowledge of. I think that there's this idea, and I will kind of circle back to all of this, but I think it's really fascinating. And I wrote down something that you said, that God is trying to contact us in so many ways and is constantly reaching out for us. Right now, I see a lot of people really in search of truth, in search of knowledge, in search of wisdom, and in search of information about themselves at the same time, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that people are craving to believe in something, whether it's, people who actually identify themselves as an atheist or an agnostic or an actual Christian. I think all of us want the same thing at the end of the day. I think all of us want and need to believe in something bigger than ourselves. But in order to do that, it's really, really helpful and profound to know yourself with kind of a starting point. And so I think it's fascinating that so many people, Christians included, love personality assessments, right? They love things like Myers-Briggs and Strengths Finder and Enneagram and the disc profile and on and on and on and on, right?
Yeah.
And these things are widely accepted, promoted, not necessarily by the church, but I don't think that there's ever been, it's never been demonized, right? Like, oh, your Strengths Finder, like that is scary. Like you don't have
Right. Right.
people out to you,
Mhm.
advising you against taking those types of tests. And
Yeah.
so it's so fascinating because I know that astrology is not that simplistic, but I feel like a lot of people are trying to understand themselves, trying to understand the world, but they're taking like a 1% viewpoint. I guess can you talk to that a little bit? Like what what do you think? And I know that these are big questions that we'll kind of continue digging into, but why do you think Christians, people in general, are so open and so, I would even say, like, to borderline obsessed? Like people have made it their businesses, right, to teach Enneagram and to, do all of these
Yeah.
things, folks in
Yeah.
million dollar industries. Why are they okay with that, but they're not okay with what I see in astrology is the deepest, most like clear understanding and blueprint of like who I am based on how God has created me. And nothing has ever compared to the amount of like self knowledge and compassion, and therefore compassion that I can give others, right, than astrology. But talk to that super briefly, if you would, just like why are we so okay with these assessments? But astrology is like absolutely not, even though there's, in my personal opinion, so much more depth that astrology can
Yeah.
provide.
Yeah, so I want to make a clarification because when we talk about the church, right, being for or against something, it's actually really fascinating that the church and the Bible, the church is an institution. So you and I are both Catholic. I'm a Catholic theologian, so I have to speak in those terms. That's the only way that I can understand it. So when we talk about the church, we're talking about the magisterium of the Catholic Church. However, all Christians kind of consider, the Bible, the Word of God, the Logos, right, as kind of our, well, it is the the only kind of public revelation that we're ever going to get, right, of Christianity. So it's very important. So the Bible says shockingly little about any of these things, right? About astrology. I believe astrology is mentioned one time exactly in the Bible, maybe twice. But I'm pretty sure it's only once. Um, and in terms of like personality tests, like what even is that? Like that wasn't a thing, back in biblical times. Astrology wasn't even really used for individuals. It wasn't meant to be used that way. It was meant to be used for nations and kings and important people, right? And so we have to remember that when we're talking about people being against astrology or against the new age, these are individuals. within the church, right? These are perhaps people that we see in positions of leadership, perhaps people that we, really trust to lead us and to guide us. But in terms of the magisterium of the Catholic Church, the only thing that the magisterium says is that we are not to have recourse to anything that attempts to predict the future, because the future is the domain of God. We need to go to God primarily with our concerns, with our cares for the future, with our worries, with our concerns and desires for the future. Okay. And that's really, really important, because astrology as a predictive science has failed spectacularly. And even mundane astrologers will tell you that as a predictive science, astrology fails. And now they blame the astrologers themselves, or they blame, the lack of updates, the lack of updating the practice. But the fact of the matter is that as human beings, we are so biased, we can't possibly predict the future. Which is a good thing. And so I do just want to make that point. But you're right. I mean, I was listening to a very prominent Catholic podcast the other day, and he was talking about, oh, because I have a more sanguine personality and my wife is more choleric, right? And that is that's like a medieval middle age personality test, right? They use the liquids of the body, choleric meaning more blood. So that's someone who's like more of a leader, more Martian, right? More Mars, a personality type. And then someone who's more sanguine, right? They're more chill. Melancholic is, I don't have them all memorized actually, but there are 4 personality types that they used to use. And people think that's okay, right? Like people are like, oh yeah, this is fine. But that isn't. And I think, the church, some members of the church are okay with the Enneagram, and some members of the church are against the Enneagram. And, we don't really, the Myers-Briggs it's neither here nor there. And, I think what happens is that as human beings, we have been so disconnected from ourselves. Like you even think about those of us, let's take the United States of America, because that's where we live. Like, we don't have roots here, right? Like at most people go back 10 generations at most, right? Like, but that's a very rare, the population, unless you're of course Native American or indigenous. But most of us are not connected to our roots. I'm a first generation American. Aren't you like a second or third generation American, Rachel?
Um, I don't know a lot of my history. There's yeah,
Oh,
for a lot of
I thought that you were French, your grandmother was French. So I was like, oh, you're like second generation. Um, but right. So, I mean, so case in point, thank you for proving my point. You're not connected to your roots. You don't know your family history. There aren't these stories, right? Where we know ourselves. Because of all the light pollution, we actually don't know what the sky looks like, right? Like we used to know, we used to be able to look up at the stars on a clear night and say, oh my gosh, right? Like if you ever get the opportunity to do that, right? The sky is incredible. I mean, it's amazing what you can see at night, when there's no light pollution. And so we're so disconnected from ourselves. We're so disconnected from what it means to be an earthling, right? From what it means to be, a creature here on earth. That we're seeking, right? Human beings are seeking. Of course, we're seeking God. And yes, we have this God-sized hole in our heart that only He can fill. But there's also this disconnection from ourselves and from our roots and from our history and from our tribe, right? And so I think what that has done is that has caused us to seek ourselves, right? And of course, we're seeking ourselves externally, right? We're seeking ourselves in the roles that we play for others in our life. We're seeking ourselves in therapy. We're seeking ourselves in attempts to improve our mental health. We're seeking ourselves in all of the different ways that humans do, right? In self-medication or in hedonistic pleasures. And I think what that points to is the fact that we are missing something. And I think what we are missing is we're missing the conversation that starts with in infancy and childhood with those that we love, right? There's a reason why we love hearing stories about ourselves as children, right? Like, what was I like, right? What did I do before I can remember anything, right? And so I know my kids love when I tell them stories. I remember every story my mom has ever told me about my behavior as a child, right? We want to know who we are fundamentally, right? And so those conversations are supposed to start with the people that we love in our tribe and in our inner circle. But ideally, the conversation continues and progresses with God, right? God, who do you say that I am? Right? Who did you create me to be? Why am I here? What did you make me for? Why did you make me like this? Right? The idea and what's so beautiful about Christianity is that it gives us the opportunity. God revealed himself to us, and in doing so, revealed a lot about us, right? To ourselves. Okay. And so I think we've lost that. I think modern Christianity has lost the conversation, the conversational aspect about our religion, because we can go to the Bible and we can have these conversations with God, and God, of course, uses anything, right? God uses everything to talk to us. Anyone who really has prayed deeply with God knows that, God will use a song on the radio, or God will use a book that we're reading to remind us of something, or God will, you think about someone and they call you, right? Like, God uses everything at his disposal to seek us, right? He's pursuing us because he loves us so deeply. But I think that we forget as Christians that we can talk to him and we can receive answers. Like, he responds to us, right? And I think a lot of times we are so afraid, right? Because of the, the modern kind of Catholic culture, and also the very conservative culture in the United States of America specifically, that is extremely inordinately afraid of the demonic. We're constantly doubting whether or not we're actually hearing God's voice. And so we go to what's safe, right? What's safe is the Bible. What's safe is, the magisterium and the lives of the saints, and the rosary, and those are all practices that are so beautiful and so important. But we need to hone our ear to hear and to listen to God, and to remember that he provides us with everything that we need. And one of the ways that I believe God provides us so beautifully, and the way that God, I believe, fills this inner longing of like, yes, Lord, like, I know who you are, but who am I? What did you create me to be? Why am I here? What makes me so special that you would create me out of the billions and billions of options, right? Um, and God loves us so much that he answers that question. And I believe one of the ways that he answers that is through the stars, right? And I think that that's illustrated so beautifully in the story of the Magi. But it's very important to remember, because someone could easily say in response to this, like, there is no evidence of, personal natal chart readings in the Bible, which you're right. It's important to remember what the Bible is and what the Bible is not, right? A, uh, the Bible is the word of God. It is the story of creation and the salvific history of Christ, right? It is the story of God becoming man. It is the story, it is a love story of how much God loves us, that even though we sin and even though we turn away and even though we fall, God loves us so much that he sent his only son to save us, to become one of us and to save us, right? He sacrificed his son for us. Okay. The Bible is not an anthology or an encyclopedia of every single aspect of what it means to be a human being, right? It does, I mean, as much as you search for neurobiology in the Bible, you're not going to find it. There is some math in the Bible, but like mathematics is not in the Bible, right? Like physics is not in the Bible. There are allusions to everything, right? Because that's part of the salvific history of humanity, right? But it's that's fundamentally that's not the kind of text that it is, right? And so it's really, really important for us to remember as Christians that if we're looking to the Bible to give us permission for every single thing that we are going to do, we're going to be disappointed. Electricity is not in the Bible, right? Like I could go on and on and on. There are so many things that there is no. So really the only thing that we can do is really come to know Christ fundamentally. And from there, we get from that relationship, we really can intuit whether something is moral or immoral. And to support us in that and really to guide us in that, that's why we have the church, right? The pillar and foundation of truth. And the church is really meant to interpret the Bible for us. And the church has done that, and they've done a beautiful job. And you know what the only thing that they've said about astrology is? Don't use it to predict the future. So is that a good response? Is that proof of, whether or not natal or horoscopic astrology works? I don't think we're going to find that in the Bible.
Yeah.
But in terms of, again, your original question, which was like, why are other things okay, but this isn't? I think there's a part of astrology that it's a little scary because it hits a little too close to home, because it can be very dangerous. In the wrong hands, it can be extremely dangerous. But to
Mhm.
anyone who would make that argument, I would say that the Bible can also be dangerous, right? The devil is quoted in the Bible as quoting the Bible, okay? Like if the Bible can be used as a tool for the evil one, so can anything else. And that includes astrology.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. All of that is so profound. And you're right. Anything, truly anything in our world could be weaponized. Anything,
Yeah.
absolutely anything. You said a couple things that I want to kind of circle back to. I have tons of notes here just from my previous thoughts and thoughts that I've kind of connected as you've
Yeah.
been sharing. And I think that there's a few key words that need to be addressed a little bit more. And that's this idea of relationship and connection and proof. And I think those three words really tie together so well, especially for Christians and understanding, like you said, there is just deep disconnection from God, and therefore deep disconnection from ourselves, from our roots, from others, right? And I think at the end of the day, just to echo what you said and to kind of dig into this a little bit deeper, there is deep fear in what it means to actually be in relationship and truly see something, see God and have God see you and have others see you. It's this deep vulnerability that I think most humans are like afraid of more than anything, this deep vulnerability of
Mm.
actually seeing and knowing God for who God actually is, not who the world says God is, right? And being known. That is like the deepest vulnerability. And so it's fascinating, like over the years, as you've shared these different shifts and changes and belief systems, that at the end of the day, I think that, and I would love for you to kind of speak on this a tiny bit more. Um, there's just it's this fear of being seen and being known, right? And so we are doing all of these little things that are like breadcrumbs, and we're starving for the actual truth. We're starving for actual connection, and we're starving from, and that connection starts from God, right? And then continues by knowing ourselves, and then we can be connected to other people. right? And because those lines have been so disconnected, I think that any tool that deep down people know may be a resource, may be a tool that we can use for that deeper connection is automatically demonized. And it's so fascinating. You talked about this idea of proof and all the proof in the Bible and things that are maybe not proved in the Bible, but we're still accepting in today's society. Um, this concept of being Christian means having faith, right? And having faith means not needing proof to believe, right? We have some proof, but at the end of the day, we just have to choose to have faith and choose to hope and choose to believe in God. It's so fascinating though that us humans, and especially Christians, are so obsessed with needing mountains and mountains and mountains of proof and evidence for everything else on earth, right?
Mhm.
And it's just so fascinating that my question to you is maybe a little bit lighter, but kind of based on my experience, and I would love to hear your thoughts. I had to wrestle with myself and with my faith to continue practicing astrology, and not necessarily predictive astrology, but natal astrology and mundane, right? Looking at how astrology is impacting the world and looking at, my own natal chart and that of those that I love and work with. It felt so true. It felt so right. I felt so seen and was able to deepen my personal relationship. And I know dozens and dozens and dozens of people who have had the same experience because of their study of astrology and how they use it, that I had to grapple with myself and my faith because I was trying to convince myself that it shouldn't feel good, right? And everything in my body, everything in my heart, everything in my soul and my spirit was telling me that this is okay, the way that I'm doing this and the way that I'm communicating with God and utilizing astrology. But I had this little voice in the back of my head, like most Christians do. This isn't safe. This isn't good. This is scary. Like, be careful, right? But in my core, like you said, when we have this connection with God, we have a stronger intuition, and He's able to communicate what's morally right and morally wrong. Um, I'm curious of your personal, I mean, I know we've talked broader. I'm curious of your personal experience. Did you experience that same grappling when you really started to explore astrology and obviously deepen that through your study as a theologian? And obviously it's been, a huge part of your life in this season and going forward, but not necessarily having proof at the time that you picked up the study of astrology, but feeling in your soul that the way that you were utilizing it was okay. Did you experience that same grappling? And I ask this because I think that it will be helpful for anyone listening and watching in the future that maybe stumbles upon or starts learning about astrology or is
Yeah,
exploring these concepts, and knowing that, you know, they're maybe not alone in that initial fear, right?
sure. You know, my grappling with things of a spiritual nature really started long before astrology. And I think that that is something that is very important to acknowledge, because I think oftentimes we, you know, I think oftentimes we feel that sin, we trip over sin, right? Like it's almost portrayed like, one day we're completely innocent, and then all of a sudden, we have a misstep, and then it's like this fall, right? Until we hit rock bottom. And and I think something that is really, really important to acknowledge is that God, again, is always, always reaching out to us. And oftentimes it's the moments that we're struggling the most is when God is pursuing us the most, right? And so although it is never a good thing to sin, right? Even God in his infinite goodness can take moments of stumbling or falling or um sinning to bring us back to him and to deepen that relationship, right? It's I think anyone who's married knows that like sometimes there are some arguments that you have with your spouse that, upon reconciling, you realize you're stronger than ever, you're closer than ever, you are closer than you would have been without it, right? And I truly believe that in many ways, that's how God uses sin. And I say that because I think in this world, in this society, there are so many like yellow brick roads that we're told to go down, right? Like you're supposed to, go to school and get good grades and go to college and, and do a little partying, but not too much. And you're supposed to do this and do that and then get married and find your person. And it's kind of all like laid out for us, right? And I think so many of us have had that experience of like you're doing something that you're supposed to be doing and you kind of maybe in a moment of transparency or lucidity you look around and you're like this is not that fun, like this is not what I really want to be doing, this is actually not quite where I'm meant to be. And I think it's during those moments it's God reaching down to us and helping us realize like this is not what I created you for. So I had my first such experience in college. And I was doing my thing. I was going to school. I was getting my degree. I was living with a group of girls. We went out, but not too much. I was a good girl, dated good guys, all the things. But I knew that I was like, there's so much more that I want, right? And so I started, with like Joel Osteen and prosperity gospel. And then it was Dr. Wayne Dyer and right. And so you kind of go down these paths and so that's how I kind of got introduced to manifestation and alternative spirituality, right? And The Secret. And so what I will say is that I think that is really where I became accustomed to this grappling of like this, there is an element of truth here that I don't find in the modern day Catholic Church, right? That doesn't mean it doesn't exist in the church, but I can't find it, right? The church, especially at that time, so we're talking, 15 years ago now, it was still very much like all about suffering, all about, offering it up for the souls in purgatory, all about, yeah, just this recognition of like, if you're not suffering, that means that the devil isn't attacking you, which means that you're doing what he wants you to do and he wants you to keep doing it, right? Like, so it's almost like this weaponization of suffering as proof that we're doing something right, which is silly. And so I think I was really grappling with like, but over here they're saying that like we don't really have to suffer quite so much. And of course, we live on earth. Life is suffering, right? At 50% at least, right? And life is hard, but actually it doesn't really have to be that hard. Like life today isn't nearly as hard as it was 100 years ago, and not nearly as hard as it was 1,000 years ago, And so it's like we seem to be, as humanity on this kind of upward trajectory. Um, Out of suffering. And yet, right? And yet there's still this emptiness, right? Um, and so I think that's when my wrestling really started. And that's when I realized that there is so much in alternative spirituality that can be seamlessly reconciled with the church. And that's when God really showed me, like, I'm big enough. I'm big enough to hold all of these different spiritualities. Now, Jesus does say, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one goes to the Father except through me, right? Jesus Christ is the way to salvation and to heaven, right? However, as Catholics, and this is why I love being Catholic, we know that salvation is completely the jurisdiction of God the Father. And we have no right to say whether or not someone is or isn't or won't be saved. And actually, there are a lot of traditions in the church that say that God is, oh, he is desperate for every single person to get to heaven, and that at the moment of death, there's a spiritual tradition within the Catholic Church, a saint who, this is not official teaching of the church, but was a saint or a blessed who says that at every person's dying moment, Jesus approaches that person with so much love, like just a look of love. And he appears to every single person with so much love that it would break your heart. Like it would break the all but the hardest heart,
Mhm.
right? And then, of course, the idea is that at their dying moment, they accept Christ, and right? Really, and by accepting Christ, I mean they say yes to love, right? Um, so it's really like, unless you are completely gone, unless there is not an ounce of love in you, and at that point you're repudiated, right? You reject Christ and you say, no, I prefer hell, right? That anyone else has the opportunity to go to heaven, right? As if you have an ounce of love that you can accept that, right? And so the official Catholic Church teaching, though, is that we have no right to say whether or not anyone's saved. And that's something that I love about being Catholic. That's very different from other churches in Christianity. Um, so long answer long, yes, I wrestled with astrology. Yes, I have wrestled with um, this feeling of I'm doing something wrong. However, by that point, I knew that God loved me enough that I was allowed to wrestle with him. And
Mhm.
I tell myself the story all the time of is it Isaac in the Old Testament, wrestling with the angel and saying, I won't let you go until you bless me. And of course, it's an angel, so he could have beaten, I think it's Isaac, at any point, right? Um, but he let him wrestle with him. He took him on, right? For like all night, right? They wrestled for an entire night. And I'm like, I love that. Like it's like a father, I have an amazing father. And so we used to horseplay. And my dad would wrestle with us, right? And it was an important part. It's such an important part of a child's upbringing is horseplay. And I think about how my husband wrestles with our kids, and God wrestles with us like that, and He lets us, right? And so oftentimes in prayer, I will say, like, I won't let you go until you give me an answer, right? Like I'm gonna keep wrestling with you. I'm gonna keep coming back to you, and just that I think the message that I would wish to impart on anyone listening is God loves you enough to wrestle with you, right? And so don't feel like, because you're perhaps you are participating in sin, and there are aspects of New Age spirituality that are sinful. Like, don't mess with Ouija boards, right? Don't try to predict the future. There's a lot of things that you shouldn't do, right? Um, but God loves you enough that He's willing to wrestle with you. And when I came upon astrology, um, I was just like, God, there's a reason why I'm drawn to this. And I know that there is truth in everything, right? Um, and maybe you are just sending me in to find a kernel of truth and then come back out, right? Um, or maybe not, or maybe I'm gonna fall, right? And maybe this isn't good for me. But what I knew was that it's it is okay. God is big enough. And of course, again, I don't ever want to make it sound like I am condoning sin or condoning hurting people or condoning hurting yourself or condoning, you know, I mean, you know what I mean, hedonism, and saying like, I'll be back, God, right? Like that's not what this is. But I think I think there is a seeking, in particular when it comes to something like astrology, of like I am seeking knowledge of myself so that in some way I can understand myself. And I believe that in understanding myself, it will help me understand the person who created me, right? It'll help me understand what's beyond me. And at the end of the day, that's what our heart is longing for. Our heart is longing for what's beyond, right? Earth is not our home. Earth is a stopping place on our way home. And so, yeah, I did wrestle, and I love what my husband said, because I told him, I said, um, I don't want to tell you that I'm doing this, but the fact that I don't want to tell you means I should tell you,
Mhm.
right? And so I said, I want you to know that I'm interested in this thing. I'm exploring it. I don't know what I think about it yet. But I'm doing it prayerfully. Like I know what I'm doing type thing. Like I realize that I'm stepping outside of the boundaries of, traditional church culture. And my husband said, I trust you. I trust you and I trust God. And he said, I know that you'll find your way. And so yeah.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful response. And I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think really at the end of the day, and I mean, you're the theologian, you're the scholar. I'm just a lay person finding my way, seeking God as well, right? But I think that to kind of sum that up and wrap that up, the more obsessed and the more focused people, especially Christians, are on sin and on falling and on failing and on going to hell, the
Yeah.
less opportunity and the less open they will be to hearing God, to seeking God, to finding God, because they're so obsessed with not doing wrong that they're leaving very little room to explore what is right and really know God on a deep, deep, deep level, because that requires us to be cracked open a little bit, right? Or a lot,
Yeah.
and to
Yeah.
kind of free fall and let God catch us. And I guess the last thing I'll say about that, which I think is really perfect, because the last question that I had, that is very straightforward, is um, really this idea of, okay, if these practices and specifically the tool of astrology are, again, this isn't, a conversation to try to convince anyone that they should start studying astrology, but just to really open up that conversation of, you know, I think, like you said, prayerfully try it, prayerfully look into it, ask God to guide you. And that's really what I did. And the last thing I'll say about that, with the conversation that you had with your husband, I had that exact conversation also with your husband, which I thought,
Really?
you don't know this.
I didn't know this.
No, but I think it's really a beautiful way of looking at it, because I think there's a lot of animosity and there's a lot of fear from so many people that don't understand. And so instead of asking, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Tell me about it. Instead of approaching a person specifically or a subject with curiosity, I think so many people are approaching it with fear and just absolute judgment, I think. But it was so fascinating. My conversation with your husband was very brief, but it was around this idea of, hey, I know that you are also interested in astrology. I know that you practice astrology. I know that you talk about it with Janelle and that you study it and all of this. And him knowing that I'm also Catholic essentially asked me, like, I'm so curious, like, how do you balance, and again, that conversation of grappling, right? How do you grapple with being Catholic and having a strong faith and studying astrology, as if they are two completely like incompatible conversations, right? And basically all I told him was, like, thank you for asking, because I think a lot of people just don't ask because they're scared to even ask the question. So like, thank you for asking. And really what I said is similar to what you said, is that I trust, I am trusting God on my way through it. And as soon as it stops feeling right and good and true, and as soon as there is additional layers of things that feel heavy or hard or not right in my heart, I will stop, or I will change gears, or I will let that piece go. But until that moment, I'm just taking one step at a time and like trusting God through that. And it was a really great conversation. That I think could be had among so many more Christians as they're kind of deeply exploring their relationship with themselves
Yeah.
through their relationship with God. So I love this conversation. I know we could talk for hours and hours about this, and I'm sure we will come back and have more conversations. But
Yeah.
thank you, Janelle, for sharing all of your wisdom and knowledge and history. I feel like every conversation that you are a part of is just really really informative for people, but
Mm.
also really nourishing for people to know that, there's not just one right path, and what that looks like from, an expert's perspective, but also a perspective of someone who is also just walking the walk on a daily basis as,
Mm.
a child of God, and trying to do our best. Right.
Well, thank you, Rachel. And I want to say, if I could, just one more thing, because you mentioned feeling like as soon as this stops feeling good and true and safe, right? And I think a lot of people might listen to that and say, well, we can't trust our feelings, right? Well, and so I think something that's really, really important to remember is that part of the reason why we can't trust our feelings is because we've been so disassociated from them, right? And we, especially, in our modern American childhood, we have been so socialized to ignore our feelings, right? And to lie to ourselves about what we're feeling. And so that's part of the reason why we can't trust our feelings. The other piece of this, though, is that, in the Bible, it says, by their fruits you will know them, right? And so I think something that's very, very important to remember is that what is the fruit of any practice, right? And really, I believe that this is why the church approves of some things and doesn't approve of other things, because there are things that produce universal fruit, right? Like if someone is praying the rosary every single day, that is going to produce fruit for them, like no matter who you are, right? There's a saying that goes, if you pray the rosary every day, either you'll stop sinning or you'll stop praying the rosary, right? And so I think that there are these things that are very safe that the church can say, yes, like universally, anyone can practice this safely. Something like astrology is not a universally safe practice, right? It is very easy to slip up. Someone has to be very discerning and have a very intimate relationship with Christ to be able to practice it safely. And so I think something that's important to remember is that if you are choosing to engage in any of these alternative spiritualities, spiritual practices, it's very important to pay attention to the fruit that it's bearing in your life, right? Like what is showing up for you? What is happening in your relationships? What's happening in your marriage? What's happening with your children? How is your health, right? Like all of these different aspects in our life that act as thermometers to indicate the health of our life. It's very, very important to keep a close eye on those things. And so that is something that I just wanted to say, basically as a word of caution, because as of right now, there are not a ton of super safe places to go to gain astrological knowledge. I mean, obviously, you and I know and love Lightfield Astrology. I think that's a great resource for anyone seeking. But I think at the same time, we have to remember that astrology as a practice is not a Christian practice. And since the church has really left the domain and realm of astrology, it has been co-opted by non-Christian actors. And so it's incredibly important that with anything that you do, that you approach it with this discerning eye, and that you approach it recognizing that it needs to produce fruit in your life, right? And not just good feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm glad that you share that distinction. That's really what I meant. I just am not as eloquent as explaining that,
No,
and
you did great.
is important exactly that's really what I meant, is like developing that deep relationship with God and developing that discernment like through that relationship, right? And seeing
Mhm.
exactly what you said, like, is my life, is other people's lives getting better, getting closer to God? Like, are these things bringing me and others closer to God or not? And I think that has been like a really
Yeah.
great guiding question for me, that I think is exactly what you're saying. So I love all of
Yeah.
that.
Thank you so much, Rachel. This has
Thank
been
you.
such a pleasure of a conversation.
Absolutely.